The clock on the wall ticked steadily, its rhythmic sound filling the otherwise silent kitchen. Laura stood by the sink, staring out of the window at the darkened street. The street lamp flickered faintly, casting a pale glow over the neatly trimmed lawns and parked cars. She absently wiped a plate dry, her thoughts far from the mundane chore at hand. Another late night. Another empty seat at the dinner table. Mark had called earlier, his voice hurried and apologetic as always. "I'm sorry, Laura. The client meeting ran over, and I still have some reports to finish. I'll try to be home before midnight." "It's fine," she had replied, the words automatic, void of emotion. It wasn't fine, but she didn't have the energy to argue anymore. She'd heard the same excuse too many times to count. She placed the plate on the drying rack and leaned against the counter, her gaze shifting to the small dining table in the corner of the kitchen. Ethan's plate sat there, half-eaten chicken nuggets and a few untouched peas. Her 6-year-old son had tried to stay up to say goodnight to his father, but his eyelids had grown too heavy. Laura had carried him to bed, his small arms wrapped around her neck, his soft snores a reminder of the innocence she was trying so hard to protect. The door to the fridge was covered in Ethan's drawings, crayon sketches of their family. One caught her eye, a stick-figure version of herself, Mark, and Ethan holding hands under a bright yellow sun. But something was missing. Mark's figure was drawn with a briefcase, standing apart from the other two. Even in her son's young mind, the distance between them was clear. Laura sighed and turned off the kitchen light, leaving the room in darkness. She climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. Passing Ethan's room, she peeked inside. He was sprawled across his bed, one arm clutching his favorite stuffed dinosaur. She smiled faintly, pulling the blanket over him before closing the door softly. Her own bedroom felt cold and uninviting. The neatly made bed, the muted tones of the decor. It all felt lifeless, a reflection of the state of her marriage. She sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers tracing the stitching on the duvet. Once upon a time, this room had been a sanctuary, a place where she and Mark would talk for hours, share dreams, and laugh until their sides hurt. Now, it was just a place to sleep, alone more often than not. The sound of the front door opening startled her. She glanced at the clock on the nightstand, 11:47 p.m. Mark was early by his standards. She didn't move, waiting for him to come upstairs. A few minutes later, his footsteps echoed down the hallway. The door creaked open, and he stepped inside, his tie loosened, and his face weary. "Hey," he said, his voice low. "Hi," she replied, not looking at him. He sat down on the chair by the window, rubbing his temples. "Long day. The client was a nightmare." "I'm sure," she said, her tone neutral. Mark glanced at her, noticing the distance in her voice. "I'm sorry I missed dinner again. How was Ethan?" "He's fine. He asked about you, though. He wanted you to help him with his new puzzle." Mark's shoulders sagged. "I'll make it up to him. Maybe this weekend we can?" "This weekend?" she interrupted, her voice sharp. "You said that last weekend, and the one before that. When was the last time you spent more than an hour with him?" Mark's expression shifted, a mix of guilt and defensiveness. "I'm doing this for us, Laura. For you and Ethan. Do you think I enjoy working these hours?" "I don't know, Mark. Sometimes it feels like you do. Like the job is more important than we are." He opened his mouth to respond but closed it again, unable to find the right words. The silence between them stretched, heavy and suffocating. Finally, Mark stood and headed toward the bathroom. "I'm too tired for this tonight," he muttered before closing the door behind him. Laura stared at the closed door, a lump forming in her throat. She lay down on her side of the bed, pulling the blanket over herself. The sound of the shower running filled the room, but it did little to drown out the thoughts swirling in her mind. She felt invisible, a ghost in her own home. The next morning, the cycle began anew. Mark left early, kissing her cheek mechanically before rushing out the door. Ethan chattered happily over breakfast, blissfully unaware of the tension between his parents. Laura plastered on a smile, determined to shield her son from the cracks forming in their family. Later that day, while taking Ethan to the park, Laura noticed a man with a camera slung over his shoulder. He was kneeling by a flower bed, snapping pictures of the vibrant blooms. His dark hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, and his easy smile caught her attention. "Mommy, look!" Ethan's voice broke her trance. He was pointing at the man, who had turned to wave at them. "Hello there," the man said, his voice warm and inviting. "I hope I'm not intruding on your favorite spot." Laura shook her head, feeling a blush creep up her cheeks. "Not at all. It's a public park, after all." He stood and extended a hand. "Daniel," he introduced himself. "I just moved to the neighborhood." She hesitated before shaking his hand. "Laura, and this is my son, Ethan." "Nice to meet you both," Daniel said, crouching to Ethan's level. "What's your favorite thing to do here?" Ethan grinned. "The swings." Daniel chuckled. "Good choice." He straightened and looked at Laura. "It's a beautiful park. I can see why you come here." Laura nodded, feeling an inexplicable pull toward this stranger. There was something about his demeanor, the way he seemed genuinely interested, that felt refreshing. For the first time in a long while, she felt seen. As Ethan ran off to the swings, Daniel stayed by her side, striking up a conversation. They talked about the neighborhood, his work as a freelance photographer, and her life as a stay-at-home mom. The conversation flowed effortlessly, and for a brief moment, Laura forgot about the weight she carried. When they parted ways, Daniel's easy smile lingered in her mind. That night, as she lay in bed next to Mark's sleeping form, she found herself thinking about the stranger in the park. For the first time in years, a spark of something she couldn't quite define flickered within her, a dangerous feeling she wasn't ready to name. Laura's days fell back into their familiar rhythm: breakfast with Ethan, errands, and the occasional hour spent at the park while her son played. But something had shifted. The weight of her marriage's struggles still pressed on her shoulders, but it was accompanied by a strange undercurrent of anticipation. She told herself it was nothing, a passing distraction. Yet, as the days turned into weeks, she found herself hoping for another encounter with Daniel. One sunny afternoon, as Ethan darted ahead to the playground, Laura settled onto a bench with a book in hand. She barely glanced at the words on the page before a familiar voice broke her focus. "I'm starting to think this park is your second home." Looking up, she saw Daniel standing nearby, his camera resting casually against his chest. He smiled, and she couldn't help but smile back. "Ethan loves it here," she replied, setting her book aside. "And I guess it's nice to get out of the house." Daniel sat down beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. "It's a good spot, peaceful. Though I have to admit, I come here for inspiration more than anything else." He gestured to the camera. "The way the light filters through the trees at this time of day, perfect for photos." Laura nodded, feeling the now familiar warmth of his presence. "Have you been a photographer for long?" "Most of my life," he said. "But professionally? About 10 years. It's not the most stable career, but it's fulfilling. I get to travel, meet interesting people, and capture moments that might otherwise go unnoticed." "That sounds wonderful," she said, genuinely intrigued. "I always admired people who can make a living doing what they love." "What about you?" Daniel asked, turning the conversation toward her. "What do you love?" The question caught her off guard. Laura hesitated. realizing she didn't have an answer. Once, she might have said her family, or her dreams of becoming a teacher. But now, those dreams felt distant, buried beneath years of routine and sacrifice. "I don't know," she admitted softly. "It's been a long time since I've thought about that." Daniel's expression softened. "Maybe it's time you did." Their conversation drifted to lighter topics, and by the time they parted ways, Laura felt a sense of renewal. Daniel's words lingered, sparking a quiet rebellion within her. That evening, she pulled out an old sketchbook she hadn't touched in years and began to draw. The pencil felt foreign in her hand at first, but as the lines took shape, a long-forgotten joy surfaced. Days later, as Laura and Daniel's paths continued to cross, their conversations grew more personal. He shared stories of his travels, while she confided in him about the struggles of balancing motherhood and a marriage that felt increasingly one-sided. Daniel listened without judgment, offering a perspective that felt both refreshing and validating. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, Laura found herself thinking about Daniel's question again. "What do you love?" She realized she wasn't just searching for an answer, she was searching for herself. The more time she spent with Daniel, the more she felt a pull toward him, like he was the mirror reflecting the person she used to be. But with that pull came a growing sense of unease. She knew she was treading dangerous ground, and yet, she couldn't bring herself to step away. When Daniel invited her to see one of his photography exhibits in the city, Laura hesitated. It felt too intimate, too risky. But as she stood in her kitchen, staring at the invite in her hand, Laura stood in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection. The soft black dress she had chosen clung to her figure in a way that felt both daring and unfamiliar. Her makeup was subtle but elegant, and she'd styled her hair with more care than usual. Tonight wasn't just another evening at home. Tonight, she was going to Daniel's exhibit. Ethan was staying with her neighbor, Mrs. Gallagher, a kindly widow who loved having him over. Mark was out of town for a work conference, oblivious to her plans. Laura told herself it was just an innocent outing, a chance to appreciate art and escape her routine. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. The gallery buzzed with conversation and the soft clinking of wine glasses as Laura entered. The walls were adorned with Daniel's photographs, each one capturing a fleeting moment of beauty. A child laughing, the sun setting over a cityscape, a flower blooming against a cracked wall. The images stirred something in her, a reminder of how much she had let life's little joys slip by. "You came," Daniel's voice broke through her thoughts. He appeared by her side, dressed in a crisp white shirt and dark slacks. His smile was genuine, his eyes warm. "I did," she said, feeling a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "Your work is beautiful, Daniel. Truly." "Thank you," he replied, his gaze lingering on her. "It means a lot that you're here." They wandered through the gallery together, their conversation flowing as effortlessly as always. Daniel spoke about the stories behind his photos, while Laura found herself opening up about her own struggles and dreams. As the evening wore on, the line between friendship and something more began to blur. At the end of the night, Daniel walked her to her car. The air was cool, and the city lights twinkled above them. Laura hesitated, her keys in hand, her heart pounding. She knew she should leave, but something held her back. "Laura," Daniel said softly, stepping closer, "I don't want to overstep, but I feel something here. Between us, don't you?" She looked up at him, her mind racing. She thought about Ethan, about Mark, about the life she had built and the cracks that had formed. And yet, standing there with Daniel, she felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. I don't know," she whispered, her voice trembling. Daniel reached out, gently taking her hand. You don't have to decide anything right now. Just know that I'm here. And I care about you. Tears pricked at her eyes as she nodded. Thank you, Daniel, for everything. As she drove home that night, Laura's mind was a whirlwind of emotions. She knew she was at a crossroads, and whatever path she chose would have consequences. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a choice. Laura sat in her car outside the park, her fingers drumming against the steering wheel. The autumn leaves fluttered in the wind, swirling around the playground where Ethan played on the swings. Daniel wasn't there today, which both relieved and unsettled her. Over the past few weeks, their chance encounters had become something more intentional. She had started seeking him out, her visits to the park aligning suspiciously with his own routines. But now, the weight of her choices loomed over her like a storm cloud. Guilt gnawed at her every time she looked at Ethan or heard Mark's voice on the phone. Yet, Daniel's words echoed in her mind. You deserve to feel alive. She had told herself the same thing countless times, justifying her growing bond with Daniel as a harmless escape. But deep down, she knew she was treading on dangerous ground. As the days passed, her connection with Daniel intensified. He became her confidant, the one person who truly seemed to understand her struggles. Mark, still consumed by his job, was oblivious to the widening chasm between them. He worked late nights, often falling asleep in his home office, leaving Laura to navigate her loneliness alone. She convinced herself that her growing feelings for Daniel were a symptom of her isolation, not a betrayal. But with each passing day, that illusion became harder to maintain. One evening, after tucking Ethan into bed, Laura received a text from Daniel. Meet me at the park? I'll bring coffee. Her heart raced as she read the message. She hesitated, glancing at the clock. Mark was still at the office, and Ethan was sound asleep. It would be easy to slip out unnoticed. Before she could second-guess herself, she grabbed her coat and left the house. The park was quiet under the glow of the street lamps. Daniel was waiting for her on a bench near the playground, 2 steaming cups of coffee in hand. He smiled as she approached, and Laura felt the familiar warmth of his presence wash over her. I wasn't sure you'd come, he said, handing her a cup. I wasn't sure I should, she admitted, taking a sip of the coffee. The warmth spread through her hands, grounding her in the moment. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the empty swings sway in the breeze. Finally, Daniel spoke. I know this hasn't been easy for you. I can see the weight you're carrying, Laura, but I meant what I said. You deserve to be happy. Laura's eyes filled with tears. It's not that simple. I have a son, a husband, a life I can't just walk away from. I'm not asking you to walk away from anything, Daniel said gently. I just want you to be honest with yourself. What do you want, Laura? What do you need? She looked at him, her heart aching with the weight of her conflicting emotions. I don't know, she whispered. I feel like I've lost myself, like I'm just going through the motions. Daniel reached out, his fingers brushing against hers. Then maybe it's time to find yourself again. His touch sent a shiver down her spine, and for a moment, the world around them faded away. She wanted to believe his words, to believe that she could reclaim the part of herself she had lost. But as much as she longed for that freedom, she couldn't ignore the voice in her head reminding her of the consequences. The weeks that followed were a blur of stolen moments and whispered confessions. Laura told herself she was in control, that she could keep her relationship with Daniel from crossing a line. But the line blurred more with every late-night meeting, every lingering glance, every touch that lingered just a little too long. Mark, oblivious to Laura's internal turmoil, continued to pour himself into his work. He came home late, exhausted and distracted, often falling asleep on the couch before they could exchange more than a few words. The distance between them grew wider, and Laura felt herself slipping further away from the life they had built together. One evening, after another argument with Mark about his absence, Laura found herself at Daniel's apartment. She told herself it was just a talk, but as she stood in his doorway, she knew she was crossing a threshold she could never return from. Daniel opened the door, his expression soft and inviting. "Laura," he said, his voice a mixture of surprise and concern. "What's wrong?" I needed to get out of the house," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't know where else to go." He stepped aside, gesturing for her to come in. The apartment was small but cozy, filled with photographs and books that reflected Daniel's eclectic personality. Laura felt a pang of guilt as she stepped inside, but she pushed it aside, focusing instead on the sense of comfort Daniel's presence brought her. They talked for hours, their conversation flowing as easily as ever. Daniel listened without judgment as Laura poured out her heart, sharing the pain and frustration she had kept bottled up for so long. He didn't offer solutions or platitudes. He simply listened, validating her feelings in a way Mark never had. As the night wore on, the boundaries between them dissolved completely. When Daniel reached out to touch her cheek, Laura didn't pull away. And when his lips met hers, she surrendered to the moment, letting herself feel something other than pain and loneliness for the first time in years. The affair began in earnest after that night. Laura and Daniel found ways to see each other whenever they could, their secret meetings becoming the highlight of Laura's otherwise monotonous days. She knew it was wrong, but she couldn't bring herself to stop. With Daniel, she felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. But as the weeks turned into months, the cracks in their fragile illusion began to show. Daniel started to push for more, asking Laura to consider leaving Mark and starting a new life with him. Laura, torn between her love for Ethan and her growing feelings for Daniel, found herself trapped in a web of her own making. The turning point came when Mark, weary of the distance in their marriage, began to notice the changes in Laura. He started coming home earlier, making an effort to spend more time with Ethan and reconnect with his wife. But Laura, consumed by her affair, saw his efforts as too little, too late. One evening, as Mark tried to initiate a conversation about their struggles, Laura snapped. "Why now, Mark? Why are you suddenly trying to fix things after all these years of putting your job first?" "Because I love you, Laura," Mark said, his voice filled with desperation, "and I can see that I'm losing you." But Laura, blinded by her resentment and her feelings for Daniel, couldn't see the sincerity in Mark's words. Instead, she pushed him away, retreating further into her affair and the false sense of happiness it brought her. What Laura didn't realize was that Daniel wasn't the savior she had imagined him to be. Beneath his charming exterior lay a man with his own hidden motives and insecurities. And as their relationship continued, Daniel's true colors began to emerge. The mornings in the Saunders household had grown quieter. Laura moved through the days in a fog, her mind preoccupied and her emotions tangled. The warmth she once felt for Mark had turned into a simmering resentment, and her guilt over what she was doing with Daniel clashed with the thrill of it. She found herself lost in thought more often, her gaze distant as she folded Ethan's laundry or stirred a pot of soup. It didn't go unnoticed. Ethan, sharp for his 6 years, began to watch his mother with a growing wariness. He noticed how she sometimes stared at her phone, her face flickering between guilt and something he couldn't name. He saw how her tone with his father had turned clipped, the warmth drained from her words. Most of all, he noticed how she smiled less at home. The small moments that used to define their mornings, the way she'd hum while making pancakes or laugh at his silly jokes, had been replaced with a quiet tension that made Ethan's stomach hurt. One evening, As Laura sat on the couch scrolling through her messages, Ethan tugged at her sleeve. "Mommy, are you mad at Daddy?" Laura blinked, startled. She looked down at her son, his wide, innocent eyes full of concern. Her chest tightened. "No, sweetheart. Why would you think that?" Ethan hesitated, his small hands twisting the fabric of his shirt. "You don't talk to him much, and you look sad a lot." She opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. How could she explain feelings she barely understood herself? Instead, she pulled Ethan into a hug. "I'm just tired, baby, but I'm okay. Don't worry about grown-up things, okay?" Ethan nodded against her shoulder, but his worried expression lingered long after she sent him off to bed. Meanwhile, Daniel's influence over Laura deepened. What had begun as casual conversations at the park had evolved into long text exchanges and secret coffee dates. Daniel's charm was intoxicating, his words like a balm to her wounded heart. He encouraged her to vent about her frustrations with Mark, always listening with an understanding smile. Over time, his reassurances grew more pointed. "You deserve someone who sees you," he texted one afternoon after she'd vented about another missed dinner. "Someone who puts you first." Laura had stared at the message for a long time before replying. "It's not that simple. Mark works hard for our family. Does he work hard for you?" Daniel's response came swiftly, and the seed of doubt he planted took root. Mark, oblivious to the full extent of Laura's turmoil, was drowning in his own struggles. The demands of his job had only intensified, and the once clear line between providing for his family and being present for them had blurred. He noticed the shift in Laura, her coldness, the way she avoided his gaze. But every time he tried to address it, she brushed him off or changed the subject. One night, while Laura was in the shower, Mark sat on their bed scrolling through emails. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, the screen lighting up with a message preview. He glanced at it, intending to ignore it, but the sender's name froze him. "Daniel, can't stop thinking about today. Let me know when we can talk." Mark's stomach twisted. His mind raced, a flood of emotions crashing over him. Confusion, anger, fear. He picked up the phone, his hands trembling as he read the message again. It wasn't overtly incriminating, but it was enough to raise alarm bells. When Laura emerged from the bathroom, wrapped in a towel, she found Mark sitting on the edge of the bed, her phone in his hand. Her heart sank. "Who's Daniel?" Mark's voice was quiet, but the tension in it was palpable. Laura's mind raced. She forced herself to keep her expression neutral as she reached for the phone. "He's just a friend," she said, her tone defensive. "You had no right to look at my messages." Mark stood, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "I wasn't looking, Laura. It popped up, and from where I'm standing, it doesn't look like just a friend." "You're being ridiculous," she snapped, clutching the phone to her chest. "Maybe if you weren't so buried in work all the time, you'd understand how lonely I've been." Mark's face fell. Her words hit harder than she intended, but she didn't apologize. Instead, she stormed out of the room, leaving him standing there, stunned and hurt. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the house grew even more strained. Mark retreated inward, his self-doubt consuming him. He began skipping his usual workouts and, on more than one occasion, poured himself a drink after Ethan had gone to bed. The alcohol dulled the edges of his pain, but it also deepened his feelings of inadequacy. He'd always prided himself on being a provider, a pillar of stability, but now he felt like he was failing on every front. Laura, for her part, oscillated between guilt and infatuation. She hated the way Mark's dejected demeanor tugged at her heart, but she couldn't stop thinking about Daniel. The way he looked at her, The way he made her feel alive again. It was addictive. She told herself she wasn't doing anything wrong, that it was just a friendship, but deep down, she knew she was lying to herself. Daniel, meanwhile, began to show a more manipulative side. He subtly encouraged Laura's grievances, framing Mark as inattentive and unworthy of her. "You deserve better," he'd say, his voice dripping with sincerity. "You're too incredible to settle for this." Laura didn't realize how deftly he was pulling the strings, steering her emotions to suit his agenda. She saw him as a confidant, someone who understood her in a way Mark no longer did. But Daniel's interest in her wasn't purely selfless. There was a darker edge to his charm, a possessiveness that she was too blinded by her own turmoil to notice. One evening, after putting Ethan to bed, Laura sat in the living room, her phone in hand. A message from Daniel lit up the screen. "I miss you." She hesitated, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. Before she could respond, Mark walked into the room, his eyes bloodshot and tired. He held a glass of whiskey, the ice clinking softly as he sat down across from her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of everything unsaid hung between them like a heavy curtain. Finally, Mark broke the silence. "Do you still love me, Laura?" The question caught her off guard. She looked at him, her heart aching at the vulnerability in his expression. But instead of answering, she turned her gaze to the floor. Mark let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "I thought so." He stood and left the room, leaving Laura alone with her thoughts and the message still waiting on her phone. As she stared at the screen, a single tear rolled down her cheek. Torn between the life she had and the life she thought she wanted, Laura realized she was standing on the edge of a precipice, and every step forward felt more dangerous than the last. Daniel's words had a way of sinking into Laura like tiny hooks. His reassurances, once comforting, began to feel more like commands. Over the weeks, he grew bolder, his tone shifting from tender to insistent. "Why are you still with him?" Daniel asked one evening as they sat in his car, parked in a secluded spot outside of town. His hand rested possessively on her thigh. "You've told me how unhappy you are. What's keeping you there?" Laura fidgeted with the hem of her blouse, avoiding his gaze. "It's not that simple, Daniel. There's Ethan to think about. And Mark, he's not a bad person," Daniel scoffed, leaning back in his seat. "You're just making excuses. You deserve better than a marriage that makes you miserable. What we have, that's real." The conviction in his voice was alluring, but there was something beneath it that made Laura uneasy. She couldn't put her finger on it, but the way Daniel spoke about their relationship felt more like a claim of ownership than an expression of love. Still, she couldn't deny the hold he had on her. The thought of walking away from him left her feeling hollow. Mark, on the other hand, was no longer in the dark. After weeks of suspicion, he had finally found undeniable proof. One evening, while Laura was in the shower, he opened her laptop, hoping to find answers. What he found was devastating. A series of emails and messages between Laura and Daniel, their contents leaving no room for misinterpretation. His hands trembled as he scrolled through the exchanges. Phrases like, "I can't wait to see you again," and "You make me feel alive," burned into his mind. He closed the laptop, his heart pounding in his chest, and sat there in stunned silence. When Laura emerged from the bathroom, she found Mark waiting for her in the bedroom. His face was pale, his expression a mixture of anger and heartbreak. "We need to talk," he said, his voice tight. Laura froze, her heart sinking. "What about?" Mark's eyes met hers, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, he said, "I know about Daniel. I know everything." The blood drained from Laura's face. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Mark stood, his fists clenched at his sides. "How long?" he demanded. "How long have you been lying to me?" Tears welled up in Laura's eyes as she stammered, "Mark, I didn't mean for it to happen." "That doesn't matter," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You've destroyed everything, Laura. Do you even realize what you've done?" Laura broke down, sobbing. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't want to hurt you." But her apology rang hollow. Mark shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "It's too late for sorry. I can't do this anymore." He turned and walked out of the room, leaving Laura alone with her guilt. The next morning, Mark packed a suitcase for himself and Ethan. He didn't say much as he loaded the car, his movements stiff and mechanical. When Laura tried to speak to him, he cut her off. "I'm taking Ethan to my mother's for a while," he said flatly. "You need to figure out what you want, Laura. But I'm done waiting for you to decide if this family matters to you." Laura watched helplessly as he buckled Ethan into the back seat. Her son's confused, tearful face was like a knife to her heart. As the car pulled away, Laura collapsed onto the porch steps, her sobs echoing in the empty driveway. In the days that followed, Daniel's true nature began to reveal itself. With Mark and Ethan gone, Laura thought she and Daniel could finally have the relationship he had promised her. But instead of stepping up, Daniel began to pull away. His texts became less frequent, his tone dismissive. When she asked to see him, he always had an excuse. Finally, after days of silence, Laura confronted him. She drove to his apartment, her heart pounding with a mixture of anger and desperation. When he opened the door, his expression was one of annoyance rather than affection. "What are you doing here?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. Laura's voice trembled. "You've been avoiding me. What's going on, Daniel? I thought we were in this together." Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, Laura, I think you misunderstood what this was. I never said I wanted a serious relationship." Her breath caught. "What are you talking about? You said you loved me. You told me to leave Mark." "Yeah, because I thought it'd make you happy. But come on, Laura. Did you really think this was going to work long term?" His words hit her like a physical blow. She stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. You used me," she whispered. Daniel shrugged. "You wanted an escape, and I gave you one. Don't make this into something it's not." Without another word, he closed the door, leaving Laura standing alone in the hallway. For the first time in weeks, the reality of what she had done came crashing down on her. She had destroyed her marriage, hurt her son, and alienated the man she thought she loved. All for nothing. Laura returned to an empty house, the silence unbearable. She wandered from room to room, the weight of her mistakes pressing down on her. The family photos on the walls felt like accusations, each smiling face a reminder of what she had lost. She sat on the edge of the bed she once shared with Mark and buried her face in her hands. For the first time, she allowed herself to truly feel the depth of her regret. There was no Daniel to distract her, no Mark to blame, no Ethan to comfort her. She was alone, and it was her own doing. As the hours passed, Laura stared out the window, her mind racing with thoughts of what might have been. She knew she couldn't undo the damage she had caused, but she also knew she couldn't stay in this place of despair forever. Somewhere, amidst the ruins of her life, she would have to find a way to move forward. But for now, all she could do was sit in the darkness and mourn the fragile thread she had so carelessly unraveled. Chapter 7. Rebuilding and Reckoning. Mark sat on the couch in his therapist's office, his hands clasped tightly together. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the air conditioning, a soothing backdrop to the heavy silence that hung between him and Dr. Lawson. "How have you been sleeping?" Dr. Lawson asked gently. Mark shrugged. Better than I was a month ago. Still wake up some nights, though. Thinking about everything. Dr. Lawson nodded. That's normal. You've been through a lot. It takes time to process something as painful as this. Mark looked down at his hands, his voice soft. I just keep thinking, what did I do wrong? How did I not see it coming? It's not about what you did wrong, Dr. Lawson said. Sometimes, people make choices that have nothing to do with us. The important thing is how you move forward from here. Over the weeks, Mark committed himself to healing. Therapy became a lifeline, a place where he could untangle the emotions that had been choking him. He also threw himself into his role as a father, spending every free moment with Ethan. They went to the park, built Lego castles, and watched superhero movies together. Slowly, Mark began to feel the weight on his chest lift. He also reconnected with old friends, people he'd lost touch with during the years he'd been